of the Israel Studies Center, Vienna. I am Mitchell Ash and have the honor to be the president of this small but growing organization, and would like to begin by saying a few words about who we are. The Israel Studies Center, Vienna, is an independent organization, civil society based. We are not deliberately not affiliated with any university or other institution because we cooperate with as many institutions as possible in our presentations and lecture series. And we do not want to be dependent on any one of them. So we have set ourselves up in that way for a reason. Our purpose is to provide independent and objective information to the interested public in Vienna about the social, political, and other aspects of life in Israel today, and also about the history of Israel. Today, our talk is going to be focused on more contemporary issues, and I'm very pleased to say that we have Sarab Abu-Rabia-Queder with us from the Ben-Gurion University. She will be introduced by Norli Lapin in just one moment, and will speak for 30 minutes, and then there will be open discussion after that. I would like to ask everyone please to mute yourselves so that we can hear our speaker better. Thank you very much. Norli, it is your turn.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I have the pleasure and the privilege to welcome Professor Sarab Abu-Rabia-Queder. She's Associate Professor at the Department of Education at the Ben-Gurion University of the Negev, where she was recently appointed Vice President for Diversity and Inclusion. Her scholarship focuses on feminist discourse, on minorities in higher education, and on minorities in the labor market. Furthermore, Professor Abu-Rabia-Queder is a leading researcher in gender and women's studies in Bedouin society. The special aim of her work is to give usually silenced women in Bedouin society a voice, particularly in feminist discourse. Alongside her academic pursuits, Professor Abu-Rabia-Queder is also a feminist activist, fighting for Bedouin women's rights in the Negev. Her main activity focuses on Bedouin women's access to education, improving their employment opportunities, and combating polygamy. I think for us here in Austria, it is very surprising to hear that polygamy is a problem in modern day Israel, but it is. She's the winner of several competitive grants and prizes. In 2019, she won the Out Katam Prize from Ruach Nashit Association for her blending of academic and feminist agendas. Tonight, she's going to speak about the challenges of diversity in Israeli higher educational institutes. Professor Abu-Rabia-Queder, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Michelle and Norli. Good evening, everyone. Thank you for the warm introduction. I will start with a presentation. I would just say that my field of study focus on inequality among minorities in higher education, focusing this night, my lecture will be focused on two groups, minority groups that I studied in Israel.
Please forgive me, dear colleague, but I'm afraid that we're getting an echo here.
Oh. Okay.
Can you speak directly into the microphone?
Try, okay, now? Now can you hear me better?
It's somewhat better, but it's still difficult.
Still difficult, well. Let's see what can I do.
And Dina, can you put it on full screen? Can you do that?
Yes, okay.
Yeah.
Okay, now can you hear me?
Somewhat better.
Okay, sorry, this is the best. Okay, so my focus is on two aspects of literature or discipline, sociology of education, and gender and feminist studies. And I will speak about the challenges of diversity in higher education. So today we hear about diversity policies and promoting diversity in institutions in higher education in the West. And in Israel, it's only a recent phenomenon. So when we talk about diversity, I borrow this work, the work of Verna Myers. She says diversity is being invited to the party, inclusion is being asked to dance, and belonging is dancing like no one's watching. So this is the frame of diversity, a very nice frame which actually illustrates the aspects of diversity, not only to be diverse, but also to feel included and eventually belonging. So in order to understand how we can do it, it's important to go back to the structural, to the structures of how we do, of the minority that we deal with. And here I rely on the expanded multi-level framework of it actually, it's of racism, but I borrow it to understand diversity in three levels. The macro level, which deals with policy, history, and structural level. The meso level, which refers to the socioeconomic disadvantage, the political, the media, and the popular discourses that addressing ethnicity. And the micro level, which refers to the daily interactions with human beings, in this case, professor, colleagues, and students. So I will show you the three levels through two case studies of minorities in higher education. So for minorities, it is acknowledged that higher education is a means for advance, okay, for advancing social mobility and improves socioeconomic statuses. Thus, providing higher education for low socioeconomic status can advance them and improve their lives and well-being. For minorities, higher education is crucial, okay, for their access to to higher education for social mobility. So it is their ticket, okay, to the modern and to the modern world and to the social mobility. The first case study is about the Palestinian-Arab citizens of Israel and the relation to higher education. When we look at them, contrary to other ethnic groups throughout the world, Palestinian minorities in Israel live for most part in geographical spaces separate from the Jewish population. We know that the educational systems are separated from each other. So only at the universities, it is the only first place when Arabs and Jews meet on a daily, in a daily encounter. And for them entering the university, which is mostly located in Jewish space, in the Jewish towns, is like an entry to a new and a different cultural world that expose them to values and norms different from those of their culture of origin, as well as sharpens their unequal status as second-class citizens. If you remember the macro level, it's important to understand why especially the Arabs in general, and I will focus here on the Bedouin in particular, the Bedouin of the Negev, which is the southern region in Israel, why they are the least population with the least access to higher education. If we start with the British minority authorities, we see that during the 30s, there were a boarding school in Beersheba, which were mostly for sons of sheikhs and notables who could continue their school studies. And at 1934, there were two high schools, one for boys and one for girls. With the establishment of the state of Israel, this school building was taken over. And we know that from 1948 to 67, there was a period of military administration where most of the region schools were closed. Arab education was only available in the north of Israel. And Bedouin had to ask for special permission to avail themselves for education and employment opportunities. So my father, for instance, is one of this generation that because he was a son of a notable sheikh, he could have a special permission to study in boarding school in Nazareth, for instance. So as a result, the entire generation of Bedouin tribes, especially women, had no access to formal education. At the late 60s, when the military administration abolished, and the beginning of the 70s, the Israeli government displaced the Bedouin into towns and modern towns, supposedly modern towns, but created what is called recognized and unrecognized villages, with providing schools and education. However, if we look at the data that I'll present in a few minutes, we see that there are educational gaps between the Bedouin educational system and the Jewish educational system in terms of budgets, facilities, and so on. Only at the late 70s, the two high schools were built in two recognized villages, Tel el-Sab'a and Kseife. And while in the south, they were struggling for education, at the north of the country, we see that at 1969 and 79, the number of female Arab students who enrolled Israeli University was increasing from 141 to 305. So it were gaps not only between the southern, the Bedouin and Jewish educational system, but also between the southern and the northern part. This is a map of the displaced, recognized, and the creation of the unrecognized villages. We see here 7 recognized towns and all the unrecognized villages around it. So a bit about the unrecognized villages, because students come from these villages to study in the university. These are historical, according, of course, to the narrative of the Bedouin. These are historical villages of the Bedouin, which constitute only 3% of the Negev land. Because they are unrecognized by the state, so the state treats them as illegal, which means the state doesn't provide infrastructure, no water lines, electricity, no internet, no paved roads. So as a result, 80% of the families are below the poverty line. 75% of the women above the age of 35 are illiterate. They suffer from home demolitions. 52% are unemployed. And 43% of the Arab families own computer in their houses compared to 77% of Jewish families. And this is a photo of a home demolition watched by a child. This is some statistic about yearly home demolitions. This was important for me also to show those data to see that it increases and not decreases during the year. This source was taken from the report.
Please forgive me, Sarab.
Yes.
The slides are not moving, so we cannot see what you're telling us about.
Okay, this is a home demolitions of Bedouin society per a year. So we see here at 2013.
Excuse me, we're not seeing the slides at all. I'm sorry.
You cannot see the slides?
You have the presentation is up, but you have if you've been moving the slides, it hasn't worked.
I don't understand. So till now, you see no slides.
That's correct.
Okay. Well, how about now?
You need to put it on full screen and then move the slides up and down.
It is on full screen.
Not here.
And now? Now you can see it. So
now we see the graph. Yes, thank you.
Sorry. Oh, so we haven't seen anything from the beginning. Okay, so this is the graph of home demolitions from 2013, and we see that it is increasing in number and not decreasing. I will move to the second graph. Okay, this is the photo of the unrecognized villages, that unrecognized village that I showed earlier. And okay, I will try to move to full screen. Can you see it now? I cannot hear you.
Yes.
Okay, so So if we take all these structural factors and we go into higher education, we see that also there are some blocking factors in the entrance of Arab in general and Bedouin in particular into institution of higher education. There is the psychometric entrance exam. It's biased in 100 points against the Arab and also a Jewish Mizrahi student. Arab students, which are not Hebrew speakers, take also another exam to set their Hebrew level before entering the university. Entering the university means that they have to deal with new two languages, new second and third academic languages. Hebrew is a second language for the Arabs, and English is a third language. Entering the university means navigating between Israeli culture and between Arab culture, okay, two different cultures. The results is that 60% of Arab students study in humanities and social sciences, since they cannot, because of the bias on the psychometric exam, they cannot study medical or STEM professions. 30% study in outside of the country, Jordan, the West Bank, and Europe. And today, although all these numbers, 70%, we have 17% of Arab students in higher education, and most of them are females. Faculty, we have only 3.1% of Arab faculty in universities in Israel. Those gaps were getting even more harder during the COVID crisis, and with the move to the distance learning, I participated in a research that studied the digital gap of Arab students. So if we take the digital gap among Bedouin students is even more acute, since they have lack of infrastructures, lack of internet, lack of computers, and data show that 50,000 children lack digital facilities. They live in crowded homes, and also demolished homes, some of them, so there was no distance. Live in large families. 51% of the population is under the age of 15, and birth rates are very high, 5.1, which means that there is no privacy if they are locked. Because of the corona. So staying at home for female students is also become a burden for them because of the family and the gender responsibilities. During the studies, the distance studies, they also lose the language privilege in class. And I will show some quotes from the students that we interviewed. They also lose the access to the academic capital, which is crucial for them even more than the regular Jewish Israeli student. They lost the access to the library, to learning groups, to learning facilities that they don't have in their domestic environment. And also they lose their status as a university student, which they call Talib Jami'i, or the Arab community. To become a student, to be a student at the university is a privilege, is a status, is a very privileged status. So when you sit at home, your family say, okay, where is the university? So it is a loss of the status, and all these difficulties eventually bring to a lower achievements and higher and more dropouts. So we talk about diversity, and I would like to show a bit about inclusion or belonging, especially at the latest period of the COVID. Maha, she is a student at the Faculty of Health. She said,
excuse me, could you please advance the slides? We're still on slide 11.
Now?
There we go. Okay. Thank you. That's correct.
Thank you. She said, I used to be an outstanding for years in high school, and suddenly I have to learn more from the student next to me who has all the conditions that I have to invest more. In terms of time for studying, the Arab students feel that they need more time to study because the gap in the Hebrew language. Abir, she's a student in social work. She said, we should be seen behind the scenes. If both me and the Jewish student got the same high grade, he might have studied for hours, but I studied 8 hours. Time of studying. Siwar, a student in biology, says, because all the family gathered together, I wait till they go to sleep and start watching the Zoom lectures between 12 and 4 in the morning, okay, because of the crowded house. So this brings to an intersectional inequality. And here I have a quote from Muhammad, who is also a master's student in chemistry from unrecognized village. He said, I do not live in Ramat Aviv. Some of us live in places where the infrastructures does not exist. Our Jewish cousins live in localities where there is electronic fiber, underground fiber that allows them to use any communication company or internet in the world. To have an internet, we do not have it. Therefore, the university needs to be considered in terms of time to allow Arab students who have internet problems to submit papers late. If you want to make an appointment with a lecturer, he is not ready because there is a corona. And if through the Zoom, then he asks to coordinate a reception time, and it doesn't always work because my hours do not always match his. And at 8 in the morning, you have to find a car that will take you from the Bedouin settlement to Beersheba. And now with the corona, the buses do not take in more than 7 people. And if it's full, it will not take you there. Our public transport is not enough to get university on time. So we see here how the digital gap together with transportation gaps together intersect and create this inequality in access to higher education. The language barrier, which become even more difficult in the corona time. Reem said, many times when I used to sit in classes, if I didn't understand a concept, I would ask the lecturer and I would understand. It was not in distance learning. At first, I was very ashamed to ask. I was also afraid he would not understand me or I would not understand him. And that was a challenge. Sina says, sometimes you say something and you're not sure what it means in the Hebrew language. Because sometimes my Hebrew, especially with the Arab students, we have a little weak Hebrew. So we are more ashamed to speak. We will not know how to convey the message. We don't like to err in front of the microphone. That was the main difficulty there. So these are the main barriers that for Arab students that become more intense also during the corona crisis. I will move now to the Ethiopian Jews. This paper was done on, okay, I will at first explain the claims of the main argument of this very difficult paper. The paper claims that policies that designate to promote diversity and provide Ethiopian Jews with opportunities in Israeli institutions of higher learning create a paradox where rather than diversifying students' bodies and faculties in universities, they bolster the reproduction of national and religious supremacy of white Jews in the Israeli academia. Interviews with 50 Ethiopian students revealed that the racialized cultural index on which Israeli society structures its attitudes toward Ethiopian immigrants have not been purged from university campus. Instead, they continue to suffuse and shape those very programs that are designed to combat them. The problem is that there are several special programs to actually promote the Ethiopian Jews and to increase their diversity, their representation in higher education, but these programs create paradoxes that Ethiopian students actually disagree with. So let me speak about, introduce some data about Ethiopian Jews in Israel. We see that at 2017, 149,000 Jewish citizens of Ethiopian origin reside in the state of Israel, 41% of whom were born in Ethiopia. 35% are under the poverty line. If we compare to 22% nationwide, 1.2%, they constitute 1.2% of all students, mostly females, okay? They're mostly females, but the number of the nationwide Jewish females is almost twice than the Ethiopian rates. I interviewed 50 female, of course, not myself, but with research assistants, 50 female participants from universities and colleges, both students and graduates, where 35 were from universities and 15 from colleges, 20 were immigrants, and 30 were Israeli born. I will present three main themes very shortly because of lack of time, about which actually constitute the results of this very long research. The first theme I call the paradox of ethnic non-diversity. Usually when you came to classes, especially at the universities, we have 7 universities inside Israel. You see maybe one or not more than 1 or 2 Ethiopian students in the tracks or in the faculty or in the department. So sometimes this quota, okay, actually students think that this is the only quota maybe that it needed to fill in the color, like they say, the color in the department. Sarah says, I'm always a bit suspicious whether I got accepted because I am Ethiopian. I mean, obviously I believe in my abilities, but sometimes I wonder if it's because I am Ethiopian. I mean, so they will have a few little color in the department. There is also the burden of representation inside the class, inside the classes. Because of the infrequent presence of the Ethiopian students in university, it creates an experience of the burden of representation, which means a collective gaze into the students that equate her with her ethnic affiliation, as Thelma explains. You are the only student in your department. Raise such a subject when you don't have support a lot of times. No one really understands you, no matter what you say. Sure, they empathize with you, but no one will really understand you. So you don't want to carry that burden alone. And it's bearing a whole issue, a whole community, because you are a representative. Every title you say, people around you take it as if it's the authentic voice of your people. This is an example of how, of the experience of being the only Black Ethiopian student in class. The other tag that another tag that they suffer from, I call it between being out of place and in place. Preserving their inferior status goes also through not recognizing their academic abilities by the automatic herding into separate programs intended for unprivileged students. In practice, a labeling process is created whereby anyone of Ethiopian origin is marked regardless of their respective capabilities in the interest of keeping them in their place, namely in their inferiority in the power matrix of academia. Mira attests. I remember one meeting with the advisor to Ethiopian students. She tells me, listen, there is this program for Ethiopian students in Bar-Ilan University. Why don't you try it out? I tried asking her why. Why should I go to an Ethiopian student program in Bar-Ilan if I have the grades to try to gain admissions to Tel Aviv? She doesn't think I will get it. Again, these quotes brought from the students' own perspective. Another topic, sorry, maybe it sounds harsh, is called the apartheid of knowledge, securing white Jewishness. I borrowed this term from 2 scholars, Bernal and Villaplando, which defined apartheid of knowledge as the separation of knowledges that occurs in the American higher educational context. For many years, the knowledge of Blacks as inferior created by white hegemony. In the Israeli case, we see that the struggle over controlling dominant knowledge or producing knowledge is not relevant to only relevant to creating categories of cultural white superiority and of Black inferiority, but there is also a specific context here of the Jewish category, where Judaism is appropriated by whites through the production of knowledge in the academia. And I will illustrate it, I hope it's understood, through the quote of this student. What is astounding to see is how the white Western culture for at least 1,000 years, but let's focus on the last 600 years. Really like ties itself to antiquity, to Greece and Rome, how it celebrates it and tries to insert itself into it, because there is some kind of ascendancy, because like they were at the top, but then you look and see that they, like you, see the bias itself in the research. How don't they talk about Ethiopia? Again, Ethiopia, not even Africa, Ethiopia, which in the Iliad, which is Homer's earliest text, he too uses the word Ethiopus, Ethiopus. The word, it comes from there. It turns out Ethiopia was a nation highly valued by the Greek. No one even talks about it. Here, she actually talks about how during her studies, she studied only, okay, about the Western world and about Jewish culture from a Western point of view, not referring even to Ethiopia. Another, in the micro level, another practice, I call it blind love, securing white morality. The day-to-day encounters of Ethiopian students with the white students in institution of higher learning, often marked by the latter's professed adoration or a blind love to anything Ethiopian. I will quote, I particularly felt this with a friend of mine. He always seemed to have a need to talk to me about Ethiopia, about Ethiopians, and about food. It's like our relationship was based on my ethnicity. There is a lot of fascination, you know, lots of fascination, because Ethiopians are usually nice. So that seems to me the issue, like they are really, really nice people and they have an amazing culture. Doesn't know anything about the culture, but it is undoubtedly amazing to him. To me, that's also racism. It's like being overly nice, and justifiably too. It's also something I found to be a symptom of liberal racism. The over-familiarity is explained by Yacovi as a white passion to discover and the fantasy of Ethiopian culture rather than a real interest in them. In the academia, however, the Ashkenazi white student's adoration is also a testament of his liberalism, his class, and his occupation as an academic person. So just to summarize, the paper shows that despite diversity policies suggested at the macro institutional level, is not sufficient enough by its own to reduce racism at the meso, which is the curriculum, the financial support, and the micro levels interaction with professors, colleagues, and students. Even when universities at the meso level try to enhance the socio-economic situation of Ethiopian students by scholarship for all, it does not minimize the racialized, maybe the biased, yes, the invisible, those micro biased racialized interactions at the micro level, which is still influenced by the inferior representation of Ethiopian women. And I will end with the implication for diversity policies. And I'm going back to this expanded multi-level framework of diversity that I presented at the beginning, where every institution, I show you two pictures of two worlds, the Arab world and the Jewish Ethiopian world, two minorities. And here I go back to the expanded level of multi-level framework of diversity. Every institution should ask itself these questions at these three levels. In the macro level, the policy level, does the institutional policy considers diverse faculty, diversity, inclusion, okay? And we can ask many other questions. At the meso level, does the institution take into consideration to adapt the curriculum, the language or to assist in these socio-economic language knowledge production for minorities? And at the micro level, every institutions in their diversity policies should not forget addressing racism on campus, invisible cultural or gender biases, even if they're in the micro level, but their importance in order to feel, and I go back now to the first, the second slide, to feel that I am not only invited to the party, but I am also dancing like no one is watching. Thank you. I hope it's on time.
Thank you very much, Sarab. This was really fascinating. taking us into a very new world for us. And well, if you have any questions, please lift your hand. I'm going to go now on gallery so that I can see you all.
Perhaps you might ask people to use the chat because not everyone is visible.
Yes, if you want, you can also use the chat. Also try and see the chat. If nobody, while people are still contemplating their questions, I have a question I would like to ask Professor Abu-Rabia-Queder, and this is the number with regard to percentage of students, because this is something that I've been wondering about for quite a while. When you say that 17% of the students in higher education are Palestinians, are Arabs, this is according to their number in society.
Right. In all the the numbers in all the 7 universities in Israel.
Yeah, but I think that the Palestinian population is about 16%.
It's
Israel.
No, it's 22%, 21, 20, almost 22%.
Ah, okay.
And I'm referring to the Palestinian citizens of Israel. And so we see the division actually different in the various universities according to the distance or proximity of the Arab villages. For instance, in my university, there are 10%. In Haifa universities, 40% of the students are Arabs. Okay, so this is the national average, that represent the national rates in all the universities, but the divisions are changing. This is a good rate. This is a good representation, but this is exactly the 3 parts that I referred to. In terms of diversity, okay, so we have a representation, but we need more. We need inclusion and we need belonging.
Thank you very much, Mitch.
Thanks. Louise, did you want to speak or not? Your hand is up. I just wondered. No, okay. I have 2 questions. The first is somewhat narrow and the second is much broader. As the first question is relates to this really extraordinary statement on one of the slides about the Iliad and about Homer and why Ethiopia is not mentioned. That is, I find quite fascinating. 600 years is a nice phrase, but actually what she's referring to, historically speaking, is a discourse privileging the Greeks that begins in the 18th century. Although the Renaissance, of course, goes back to this stuff too. What we're now confronting is a cultural privileging that was really cemented in the 18th century and into the 19th, and became institutionalized in classical philology, in the discipline itself, which I find you might be aware that there is an effort now to decolonize classical philology. And it might not hurt to integrate that into perhaps into Israeli education in some way, at least the attempt to make people aware that ancient culture, so-called Greek culture, is not just white and never was. That would be quite useful, perhaps. That's the narrow point. The broader point is that I was absolutely astonished at the statements that were quoted because they could have been made by Black Americans as well. In some cases, even today. So-called affirmative action, of course, is what was being adopted here. And I'm wondering whether the programs that the Israelis have adopted have been, shall we say, copied or borrowed from American affirmative action programs. Is that where they come from? Or has there been an effort to try to adapt them to Israeli circumstances? Because the impact in America is exactly the same.
Mm-hmm. Well, first of all, thank you for the first comment. It actually also intersects with the, these students have a lot of criticism on being Black Jewish, which being perceived as an inferior Jewish. For instance, they also in their paper refer to being to the suspicious of in their Judaism during the Zionist from the Zionist movement, from the state of Israel, not being included in the history of the Israelis and so on, but also not teaching about their history also in the curriculum in schools and in higher education. Now, referring to the second question, I'm not sure if it is taken from the American educational system or not, but here it's the Higher Education Council that start these preparatory programs, special programs. We have this trend that each society, according to its needs and the gaps that they face, a special program is structured for it. So for instance, Ethiopians used to have in some universities, not all of them, special tracks, okay, special preparatory programs in order to enter the university. In the recent years, the voices of the Ethiopian community and the message was, we do not want separate programs. We do not want to be separated, not in higher education, not in civil society, not in schools. We do not want to be separated. We want to be integrated in the mainstream Israeli higher educational system and also the educational system. For the Arabs, it's a total different story. The Arabs came from, they have other gaps that I mentioned, okay? Not for Ethiopians, for instance, Hebrew is not a main obstacle, but for the Arabs, it is a main obstacle. So they want these special tracks. They need the preparatory programs separated in order to fill in these gaps to attend the university. So I also for Haredim, for the, how you say it in English, the ultra-Orthodox Jews, that they are already separated in their educational system. They also want separation. You probably heard that in the news about the big debate about whether to separate them or to integrate them, and also the debate between the white liberal feminist versus the non-white feminist or the religious feminist debate or a discussion between the two perspectives. So yes, every program is tailored according to the needs of the special, so they're not the same. Some campuses, for the Haredim, for instance, are separated from the main campus, okay? They have their own camps. In some universities, they have their campuses far away from the universities. Lecturers from the students from the main campus teach in another separated campus. They receive the degree from the university, but they don't come to the university. Okay, this is also another kind of division or track. So if it's similar to what happens in the state, you can tell me.
I was thinking specifically about the remarks of the student who was saying that she feels the burden of being a representative because she's the only one in her group who actually comes from Ethiopia. This is was for many years and still is in some places a quite common issue for African American students as well, and or Black students as they now prefer to be called. Now the sad part is that affirmative action has been in place in America since the 1960s and 1970s. So that gives us an idea of how long these changes might take. And yet, even now, some of the same statements that your subjects have made could be made by some Black students today in the United States as well. So one could ask, after 40 years, what has changed? I think that's a bit too strong because actually much has changed. But these problems have not entirely been solved, even in the United States after 2 generations.
I agree.
The chat is empty, no hand is up. Yes, there's one hand up. Jacqueline Hackel, please.
Hello, thanks for your lecture. I was thinking about the fact that you mentioned that it is especially also a thing of hierarchies. So in the student numbers, it is more equal than in the lecturer or higher up positions in university. Did I understand that correctly?
Let me see if I understand you. You're asking if the rates of the representation of students is higher than the representation of the faculty?
Yeah.
Yes, yes.
Very much so.
Very much. The gap is big. Yes.
And I was thinking about the role that these quantitative measurements, when it is about employment, are also setting up some. It looks like being neutral, but then it measures things that are harder to achieve for some. So and also that if you want more faculty equality, then you need to also guide students to reach those things that then count for the employment. So what counts in the decision who gets the job? And I think that's something that often is not done sufficiently by universities to make transparent the conditions on which ground these decisions are made. So this is also a factor in the inequality in faculty.
It's called tacit knowledge in the jargon that's passed along from one generation of academics to the next, and is not always explained in a way that people who are outside the system can understand.
Yes, and so this might also very much come to.
Yeah, I think in order to get a position, if I understood your question, in order also to get a position at as a faculty at the university, you need to get also to have not only to be graduate, you have to be also a PhD graduate. And the number of PhDs in Arab society is not very high compared to the Jewish population. But now we see that there is a growing in the number of doctoral students. But yes, not all of them could find positions at the faculty. The barriers are very varied. And some of them, especially for women, the postdoc, going out to postdoctoral outside the country to do a postdoc is a barrier, is another for all women, but especially for Arab women. And don't forget that most of the PhD students or candidates among the Arab females are still first generation. First generation, this population, this category is very important. In our institutions, they're still not recognizing this category. So in my position, during my 2 years, first 2 months in my position, I decided to put a spot on this category and to start a bottom-up process where we give a toolkit for PhD first-generation student, and I deliberately called it first generation in order to include other invisible groups such as Mizrahi Jewish students that they don't receive special funds, from the Council of Higher Education. So when you give them these lectures or empowerment from role models and about how you make a postdoc and what is that, all the soft skills to the academic journey, this is something that could empower them. but also the system is very, very competitive in order. So we inside the academia, the academic milieu, we know, you know that we know what are the objective criteria needed in order, to get into this, to be a faculty. But again, the policies, again, if we take the macro level, I think in the policy level, universities should set some diversity goals, like we have rates of gender representation in the universities. We need also to set diversity goals or rates that we aspire to it, and maybe this also will increase the number of the Arab faculty from diverse groups. So I hope I answered your question.
Yes, thank you. You answered the question I wasn't even able to ask. It was the question behind my what I said before that you answered. Thank you.
Okay, Louisa, I see that your hand is raised.
Yes, it was raised from the beginning. Thank you very much for this fascinating lecture. I was really overwhelmed with the facts you presented, especially because some of them seem really amazing to me. First of all, I would have gathered that most Arab students, due to language difficulties, would flock to sciences and not to humanities. Is it only because of the psychometry, or are there other reasons that they choose humanities? I have three questions, okay?
Okay, so can we go one by one? It's late in the evening for me.
Okay, fine, go one by one.
I might forget. I'll try to make my answer short. It's a mix of things. First of all, in order to get to the STEM and also the health science, the health faculty, you need a very high psychometric score in the psychometric exam. So it's difficult, like I said, but also the gaps from the educational system, the Arab educational system. When they study Hebrew, by the way, they study Hebrew as a second language. They study English as a second language. So at the university, it's the first time that they have to encounter even a daily spoken Hebrew. Even a daily spoken Hebrew. Sometimes I meet students that they cannot phrase a full sentence in Hebrew to communicate. It's very difficult. But when I refer to the Hebrew and the gaps in the Hebrew language, I meant through their studies, when they study inside the university, in terms of writing papers and reading papers in these languages. So this, and also speaking using those languages. No, but the main gap is the psychometric exam. Yes, this is the main gap. By the way, maybe I should explain a bit about the psychometric exam. It is done in few languages. The main language is Hebrew, but the Arabic is translated from Hebrew. It is not written by Arab speakers, professionals, taken from the Arab culture material. No, it is translated. That's why the bias. So what is the second question?
I see. Well, I just wanted to add. I mean, I know that the psychometry you need a very high psychometry outcome for medicine, but there are other subjects in sciences which you can probably study easier, even if your Hebrew is not that good as for Israelis. The second one is the quota of female students, which I find amazing. In both minority groups, you said there are much more female students than male students.
How I explain it? First of all, if I look at the Arab minority, 20 years ago, it was the opposite. Male had more options or opportunities to study culturally, yes, to go out, permission to study. Things have been changing, and we see more and more male students studying also abroad. And some of them, this was till recently. Nowadays, we see, why we see more girls, we see more dropout from high schools among male students. In high schools, we see higher dropout rates of males than females. So I think these statistics might explain why why more females continue into a higher education. The same is for the Ethiopian minority. The same situation. And also don't forget that in Bedouin society or Arab society in general, why there is a high dropout rates for boys, because they go to work. Okay, they feel that their mission, because of the economic burden, because of the poverty, they sometimes had to drop out and go to work and help in the family business.
Well, thank you. I just wanted to add why is the dropout rate from high schools higher, but you just answered the question before I was able to ask. So the third point would be, you said there are special programs, so ghetto programs for Ethiopian Jews who actually don't want to be in such programs because they want to study together with all other Israelis, whereas Arab Israelis would have liked such special programs, but there are none set up for them. So my question would be, do you think this is deliberate policy of the government, or just that nobody has thought of
maybe
special programs?
Maybe I did not explain myself clearly. There are special programs for Arabs. This is what I'm saying. I said that the Council of Higher Education does funds special programs for Arabs, but again, to fill in the gaps. For Ethiopians, it's also to fill in the gaps. There's different gaps. Now, I didn't say that the government doesn't. We did receive funds for a program called Sha'ar Academia, and also there is the Council of Higher Education funds for Palestinians from East Jerusalem who study at the Hebrew University, Bedouin who study at Ben-Gurion University. So these special programs for very, very disadvantaged minorities inside the Arab minority.
But not in general.
No, not in general, no.
Okay, thank you very much.
Mitch?
I don't want to dominate, but I don't see anyone else having a question. So I just want to make an ironic comment. This is not meant to be a criticism of your talk in any way, because I've learned from it tremendously, but I want to speak from the point of view of an American Jew about the labeling of Ashkenazis as white. This is also true in the United States, and there's a historical irony there. I'm speaking now as a historian and not just as someone who's experienced this. Back in the day, shall we say, in the 19th century, in fact, up until about 1960, the label white was not so obvious because Jews were strongly discriminated against in academia. And in the 19th century, Irish and Italians were also. And all of these groups have a memory of their history of discrimination and persecution in the United States. And some of them are still puzzled by having been thrown into the same box as the white Christians in recent years. Of course, there's a reason for that. It's got to do with advancing the interests of the people of color, and I don't object to it in principle as a political position. But I'm just pointing out that the breakthrough of Jews into American academics occurred in my generation, which is the 1960s and 70s. So it's not so old. And therefore, it makes me feel a bit strange to be put in the box with the people who were not discriminated against in the past.
I think it depends. Thank you for your comment. Yes, I think it depends on the culture, in the context itself. I mean, if we take the Israeli context and we take the, you know, the Aliyah and the Zionist movement and its treatment toward Mizrahim and toward the Ethiopians, it's different from the context that you're referring to, the being a Jewish in the States. These are two different contexts. So in one context, you are the disadvantaged, but in other contexts, you are the supremes. You are part of the hegemony. And this is something that has been discussed in research. It is part of the Israeli context. You know, you also referred in your point that some population have the history of the racism. I think that the Ethiopian Jews are just starting to write or to recall the history of their racism. It's by Ethiopian scholars themselves and by non-Ethiopian scholars. So even the term racism in Israel has been introduced only at 2008 because of the fear of being attached to the Shoah and to the Nazis. So in recent years, we see with the Ethiopian activism and demonstrations against the daily racism that the term racism entered the academia. And by the way, very few researchers use it. Not all researchers, not all scholars dare to use to work with the term racism. So we call it discrimination, we call it inequality, biases. You have many ways to use many terminology, okay, to soften the powerful of of using when you use the term racism because of the Israeli context, sensitivity to this term. So I think it depends, on the context.
Is the term white also used for the Palestinians?
Comparing, when we compare between the Jews and Arabs, you mean, between Palestinians and Israelis?
I'm just trying to figure out what the term white, to whom the term white refers.
From the point of view of the Palestinians, the term white refers to also to the Israeli Ashkenazi. Yes, unfortunately. Yes, Ashkenazis has to bear the burden of being white, like the Black people or the Palestinians bear the burden of being a minority. Yeah.
I am going to take the privilege of a moderator and also ask another question. I would be very interested to know if you say in Haifa, 40% of the student body is Palestinian. And in Beersheba is only 10%. Now, is that difference in a sense of self or in self-assertiveness among the students in Haifa rather than Beersheba? How does the fact that they're 40% affect their behavior, their feelings?
I don't think I understand your question.
If you say you have 40% Palestinians in Haifa, this is almost half the student population.
Yes.
This is let's say, a critical mass. Do they still feel maybe weaker or discriminated against, but don't they feel the strength of the mere numbers?
I don't think the number makes a difference. Again, if diversity is there in terms of representation, However, we have to also move on to make them feel in policies of institution of higher education, to make them feel included, to make them feel belonging. Now I know that because of this trend now of this position of VPs of diversity and inclusion, we have this only in 2 universities, the Hebrew universities and the Ben-Gurion universities, and there is an advisor, not a VP, but an advisor at Tel Aviv University. I know that now in Haifa, they are thinking also about this appointment. So I think maybe this new awareness of the policymakers, in the institutions itself will make them adopting this kind of policies to make the students feel more belonging.
Mm-hmm.
I'm being vague here. I'm being vague because I'm on live, but I'm being vague because not all policies are equal, make inclusion, make you feel part of it, make you feel belong. So I hope the message is
fascinating. It really is. Well, I think it is time to wrap up here. Thank you very, very much for all this fascinating and rather new information. And I wish you lots of success as an academic, but even more so, I think, as an activist. I think you have a lot of work ahead of you. And today we didn't even talk about the women.
Right. Thank you all. Thank you for inviting me and for the questions and the fruitful discussion we had here.
And I also want to thank our audience for coming, for participating, and I hope to see you at our next lecture. Good night.
Thank you all. Good night.